We're back. We're back. Main Joe at the controls. Thank you once again, as always. We're here in Mojo Studio.
Mojo Studio.
And it's a beautiful Saturday. Well, it's kind of a beautiful Saturday.
It was all right. About 4 o'clock on.
Yeah, it was a nice drive today. Our guest Will asked me to come pick him up, and you know, when you get a guest like of this stature, I'd have sent a limo for this guy.
I'm always amazed that people think I'm anything special. I just don't see it that way. I live inside this head, and I know how I've done all the different things I did, and I credit it more with luck and good support from the people who love me. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm anxious to get on to some of your studies in history and your writings, and why is it you found mainly Utah history to be so fascinating? And but I don't want to leave the river until we've covered as much as we can, the most interesting things we can.
Well, I'll summarize it because it's a transition that was very important in my life, and I think it's sort of natural, but. What I was trying to do with the raft trip down the Mississippi and pedaling a bicycle from Ann Arbor, Michigan to Santa Cruz, California, and a variety of later dim-witted undertakings was to try to get a sense of what it was like in the 19th century. And I did move back to the Smoky Mountains in North Carolina for a couple of years. And that definitely made me much more aware of how tough the 19th century was and what poverty was really like. Because
so
now...
Poverty had a hold of that region even back then?
Oh, yeah.
Interesting.
Well, what had happened was... it was being depopulated. There'd been not only was there a massive black migration from the north to the south, but poor white people left to get jobs in factories in Detroit and other industrial cities. Mm-hmm. And the average family income when I moved to Madison County, it's called Bloody Madison, was $2,000 a family.
Wow.
And they had big families.
Yeah.
But I did learn a lot, and it gave me a sympathy for how tough these people were and how hard scrabble the times were. Yeah. And today, in the 21st century, it's almost impossible to appreciate how hard American life has been through most of our history, because we're truly spoiled.
Yes.
Yeah, Mojo and I talk about that. We're in the top 1% of the world population. You know, we're living like kings practically.
Truly.
Well, actually, we're living a lot better than kings.
There you go.
If you go and look at how French nobility lived.
Yeah, it was disgusting.
It was pretty disgusting because it was much more primitive.
Yeah. I read about this recently. Will, sorry to interrupt you, but I didn't read about it actually. I think it was Adam Ruins Everything, a show on YouTube. You know, people think of castles and they think wealth and glamour and splendor and gold and and all
opulence.
And it was disgusting. There was vermin. There were no.
It was cold
and drafty and terrible, and the bathroom facilities where I won't even get into. And,
what bathrooms?
Yeah, exactly. It was but yeah, you were. I mean, I would rather live in a teepee than some of these castles. And so anyway, I'm sorry I interrupted there. Where were we drifting?
Well, it brings to mind a couple of key phrases, which was pot to piss in.
Yeah.
You know where that came from?
You were rich.
Tanning. Because urine was one of the main components of tanning animal skins.
I did not know that.
Yeah. Which were basically except for furs, the only warm garments that people could find. And so people collected their urine and take it down to the tannery and get a penny or something for it.
Wow. Did not know that.
And the other is the Valley of Smokes. And we're now sitting at the top of an inversion in December, and it's partly a phenomenon of geography because we are in a big basin, and when the high pressure system sits in, we get screwed. And one of the names the Indians had for the Salt Lake Valley was the Valley of Smokes.
Well, interesting. I was going to ask you about that. What was the inversion like back in those days?
Not as bad as this.
Yeah, but it still existed. The Indians had a name for it. So, yeah, interesting.
So what, burning campfires would even make inversions back then or something?
Well,
I mean,
the inversion with even it's just the different air temperatures is what creates the inversion. The campfires and all the automobiles, they just add to it, and then all that pollution gets trapped.
Well, I'm talking pre-industrial though.
Yeah.
I guess
but inversion is just a matter of different temperatures and how the basin is shaped, like Will said.
I remember the worst one we ever had. Well, I think it was back in 83, 82, and I was skiing a lot back then. And coming down the mountain at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was just a brown blanket.
It's still that way.
It's still to the the worst one though. I think we went like 42 days without seeing the sun one year.
Wow.
It was unbelievable. That would be brutal. I think it was before you came here, man, Joe.
I would be skiing a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because up there it's beautiful.
Yes, it is. But anyway, so.
So you're picking up these experiences while you're in school, like summer vacations. You're doing the river, right, during summer vacation, essentially, and then the bike trip. I assume you're also still in college when you took that challenge on.
I'm trying to think, what year was that? No, I graduated from college.
Okay,
so.
But you didn't graduate from college and say, "I am now a historian. I'm going to write books."
Yeah. Well, I was sure I was going to write a best-selling book, and this would be it.
Nice.
River fever.
I never did learn to spell very well till spell checkers came along, but I did write.
Yeah, on the river trip, you had a journal that you kept up.
Yep. And so in 1975, I wrote an early version of what is now River Fever. And the way you learn to become a writer is you write.
Yes.
It's the only way.
Stephen King. That's what he says, too. Yeah.
He certainly knows. But there's so many writing programs these days. Every university has one. Wallace Stegner helped invent the format. But the bottom line is that most people who go to these programs don't do very much writing. And the trick is do it every day. Find a job where you have to write. Be a journalist. Be a technical writer, which is what I did through the 1980s.
Yeah, we'll get to that. That's going to be.
I want to get to that. Yeah.
And I did put in my 10,000 hours or whatever that myth is.
Yeah, right.
But I realized after a while that I wasn't going to write a best-selling novel, but I did have a talent for writing history. And I was 40 years old before I published a book.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
How many have you published? A little aside. Can we ask?
Well, it depends on how you define a book, but easily 25.
I was going to say, you're up and around the 20s. I think on Amazon you got about 20 books for sale.
You know, you remind me again of Christopher Hitchens, where he was also a big writer of history and politics and nonfiction. And he was asked once, you know, Mr. Hitchens, you're such a brilliant writer, and your prose is awesome. Why don't you write a novel? Why don't you do a George Orwell in 1984 or a Hemingway? And he goes, I just don't have the music in me for that sort of thing. And I thought it didn't make much sense. Now I know what he means. You got to have some kind of a music about you and have the writing skills and the desire to write. Then you can get into the Animal Farms and things like that and the River Fever. And
there is one novel I'm tempted to write, though.
Oh, do tell.
It'd be called Triggerite, The Life and Times of Porter Rockwell, the Mormon serial killer. And I've done an enormous amount of research, and I've been collecting all the stuff that's come out about Porter Rockwell.
Was he at Mountain Meadows?
No, he wasn't at Mountain Meadows.
Okay.
But he was at a lot of other really messy places.
Interesting.
We could do a 2-hour podcast on that subject alone, Porter Rockwell.
Oh,
Absolutely.
yes.
Yeah.
Maybe we will someday.
I hope to.
I
hope
hope
so.
to have you back because I know we won't get to it all tonight.
We're not going to cover. We're not going to scratch the surface of this guy.
Yeah.
Sure you have. You've gone as deep as it goes.
So far, you're in school, you're collecting all these experiences, you're journaling, you know you can write, you're planning on writing a book someday.
But I'm under the illusion that every writer has, which is that the world is dying for the book they've got in there.
Yeah.
And once it appears, it'll be a bestseller. And I maintained that until about 6 months ago.
Oh.
Or at least until River Fever appeared.
What did you go to school for? What were you studying in college?
History.
In California. History, okay.
I got a degree in history.
Okay, but not necessarily writing. The writing was you just took upon yourself, like, I'm going to be a writer and I'm going to journal and I'm going to
Well, I
figure
took
this out.
writing courses. I've only had one writing teacher, and it was Paige Stegner, who was quite a successful writer himself, and he was Wallace Stegner's only child. And I thought he handled that pretty well. He became a noted environmentalist and a dear friend for years and years and years. But writing is tough, and every writing teacher a good writing teacher starts by saying, get a day job. Don't believe that you're going to be able to support yourself, right?
Yeah.
Well, Henry David Thoreau had the same sentiment too. His day job was walking around Walden Pond and having experiences and adventures. Then he would go home and write. If he didn't go out that day, if he was feeling a little sick, or he just didn't go, he wouldn't write. If he didn't go out and do anything, he wouldn't write. So a day job has kind of another lining to it, is have something to write about.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
good point. And boy, you have a lot to write about.
Yeah.
You have you sailed down the river, Mississippi River, more than once. You've ridden a bike from Michigan to California. You've lived in poverty-stricken area out east.
But it was beautiful.
Yeah, I've seen pictures.
Spring Creek, North Carolina.
North Carolina. You played in a band. You played music and got paid for it.
Actually recorded some. Yeah.
I made a long-playing record album.
What was the name you told me on the drive in?
It was called The Legend of Jesse James.
I love it.
Wow.
And I recorded parts of it with Cow Jazz,
A local band here in Salt Lake.
which was a legendary country rock band, the best Salt Lake ever produced.
Wow.
And had a crazy lead singer named Jack Quist, who's still out doing Johnny Cash impersonation.
Nice. I want to see the book on your music career now.
That's our
Well,
next one.
if you search Bagley, Jesse James, you can probably get to the podcasts on
Cool.
YouTube,
I'm going to do
which
that.
are
Look it
not
up.
haunted
Nice.
deeply.
So
But
you
anyway.
graduate with a degree in history. You're doing all this interesting stuff. You were a carpenter at one point, too. I mean, you built a raft. I mean,
Well, I spent a lot of time in construction. And then I went to Evans and Sutherland.
and so while you were getting all these experiences and you were writing journals, but did you ever attempt to write a book?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? It just
I'd
never
written
got
one-
published? Or
I'd written what I called River by 1975.
Okay.
And then I digitized it after I went to work for Evans and Sutherland on a Wang word term.
Wang. I remember Wangs.
Sounds familiar.
Wangs were great.
Wow.
And I was convinced, because I was part of this pioneering computer graphics effort, that we would change the world and change it for the better.
Yeah.
I did the same thing. Well, you were mentioning, every writer thinks I'm going to write the book that'll take the world by storm, And Mange, I don't know if you were similar to me, but, when I was a 22-year-old GIS programmer, I'm thinking, all right, I had all the vinegar in me. I'm going to write this GIS application that everybody in Utah is going to use. The closest I got was 3 municipalities used it, and they got it for free. And that was it. So I was under no more illusions after that. It's a paid gig. I'm not taking the world by storm. I'm not going to be a Bill Gates here.
Yeah.
So
No, and 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Better Than Google, LexisNexis and the Creation of the World's First Dynamic Search Engine.
Wow. Yeah.
And it is a fantastic story because I talked to the Oxford University graduate who microcoded it in 1972.
Wow.
And he liked the book so much that he bankrolled getting it typeset and proofread and ready to put into a book.
Mm-hmm.
And this was all ready to roll last April. And I sent to the family of the lead character, whose name was Jerome S. Rubin, or Jerry Rubin, in another irony of history. And they threatened to sue me if I didn't cease and desist. And here I was all ready to go to a
publisher.
Well, no, I was going to be my own publisher.
Okay.
And I was going to produce a quality book in 1,000 copies. And I thought, well, I can probably sell 1,000 copies. I sold 1,000 copies of a record in 1980.
Wow.
And I think I have that many fans. But they essentially shut down the project.
Wow. So that book doesn't exist? Or it's never been published?
It's in paper. And the typesetting, it's all ready to go. And Marcus Byrick, who was the microcoder that did it, is still trying to talk the Rubin kids into allowing us to do it.
Wow, it's history,
But
man.
but it was basically, I just didn't want to face marketing a book. Marketing is the black art of everything.
It's the worst. Yeah.
Why is Bill Gates a billionaire? Because he's a great coder?
Yes.
No
Yes.
way.
No, you're absolutely right. I'm sorry. When he sold the first DOS operating system, or I should say when he licensed it.
Stole it.
Exactly. Well, he bought it.
stole it from CSM.
I thought he bought it from some guy, but I'm going off of a movie I saw. It might have glamorized him a little bit. Maybe
Could
he
be.
did steal it. He did not write DOS. He did not.
Oh, no.
He became a billionaire by licensing it, but he did not write it. It's interesting.
He became a billionaire by ruthless marketing.
Yeah.
If Apple had somebody who wasn't the former president of Pepsi at its helm in 1990, they would have made the operating system the core of the business and licensed it, and there never would have been a Windows, and the world would not have missed it.
Yeah, interesting.
Because Windows is an aberration. At least, although I'm now abandoning Apple thanks to its ruthless marketing, and I probably go to a Wintel machine now.
Linux, man.
Linux is the bomb. Yeah.
That's where I should have learned it, Evans and Sutherland.
Well, why is it Windows is so virus prone, but Linux and Apple and all those never seem to get a virus, but they're all over the Windows machines. I don't know.
Because that's what everybody's using.
Oh, well.
That's where the
yeah,
market
I guess
is.
the simplest answer is usually correct.
There
yeah.
we go. But anyway, so what River Fever is about trying to make your dreams come real. And my dream since I've been a little kid was to be a writer. And as I aged, I've been fascinated by history, and it's partly because of where I grew up. And I grew up in Utah. I was a Mormon. I was taught all this mythical history, and I really liked it. It was really fun to learn all this stuff.
So you spent more time in Utah early on than your brother Pat. You guys moved to Oceanside. Yeah. How old were you when you first moved to Oceanside from Utah?
I was about to turn 9.
Okay.
But Pat was only 3 years old.
Yeah.
And we got on the Union Pacific to go to L.A., and I remember looking at Pat and thinking, Pat won't remember snow. It was February.
Interesting.
It was his birthday, I think. It was February 10th, and there was snow everywhere
Yeah. Yeah.
because we used to have heavier snowfalls. But even in California, I was intrigued by the history
Of Utah.
of California.
Of California. Okay, gotcha.
And Californians don't care about California history. They're all about the future. But in fact, I just completed this year a 16-volume documentary history called Kingdom in the West, The Mormons and the American Frontier. And it came out from the Arthur H. Clarke Company, which is the oldest and most distinguished
Publishing houses.
publisher of Western history.
And again, listeners, that's Arthur H. Clarke. Please
Yep.
do not confuse it with Arthur C. Clarke.
And it's been run by 3 generations since it was founded in 1902. And the last volume of Kingdom in the West is called "The Whites Want Everything." Indian Mormon narratives, 1847 to 1877. And that's the hardest book I've ever written because it's about one of the 2 great American crimes, which is
Slavery and Native American genocide, if I may.
exactly. That's it. And we will never pay that off.
I'd like to deviate just for a quick second. One of the things that lingers in my mind that I can't ever answer, and maybe you have an insight into this, is like how come the natives on Hawaii fared so much better than the natives on the mainland? At least it seems to me like they have. You know,
That's a good question. I have an answer in my head, but you didn't ask me. So,
And I have a deep family connection to Hawaii because my mother grew up there.
oh wow,
And my grandfather was a mission president. But if you look at there's actually a movement by Native Hawaiians to reestablish the Kingdom of Hawaii, which was really a rip-off job. It was ripped off by American
it was
corporations.
1953 when they became a state. Am I guessing?
59.
59. It was okay.
Yeah. And they were a territory till then. And why wouldn't they admit Hawaii? Because it had all those brown people. It had all those Japanese and Chinese. But the Kingdom of Hawaii was a viable, internationally recognized outfit. And in the I think it was about 1892 to 94, it was stolen. And Queen Lily Kalani was deposed and ripped off. Partly it was, well, I really can't give a good answer to why did the Hawaiians fare better, because they did encounter white diseases, not do well by
interesting.
that. But they were a pretty tough bunch.
Yeah, that's true.
These
too.
were people who had sailed across the vast Pacific Ocean, navigating by the stars and their knowledge of the nation, of the currents and the stars.
Yeah.
So they were smart, tough people.
Well, suddenly your river trip seems very trivial.
Oh, it is.
Oh,
it is nothing. But I love the history of Hawaii because why is the Owyhee River in Idaho and Nevada named the Owyhee River?
No idea.
Because in 1819, the Shoshones killed about 20 Hawaiians on the Owyhee River because the Hudson Bay Company, which was always looking for cheap labor, had purchased a bunch of Kanakas, which is translated gently as servants, and
Well, it's very gentle.
perhaps more accurately slaves.
Yeah.
And they made great seamen. They made great frontiersmen and fur hunters. And One of my great early experiences as a historian was reading a fur trader doctor's journal, and he reported in about 1847, Old Cox died today. And Old Cox had been present when Captain Cook was killed.
Wow.
And it sounds unbelievable, but Old Cox can be documented and is a well-known figure in Hawaiian and fur trade history.
Oh, wow.
So you mentioned a moment ago about a book that was one of the most difficult you ever read, or a documentary, wrote. I'm sorry. And was it? I'm going to presume that it wasn't because the material was so hard to find. It's the material you read was just hard to digest, and the cruelties that went on.
Yes.
Well, yeah. I mean, I even read a little bit about your book on Amazon. You know, they let you read some of the chapters, and I was reading about that massacre that you wrote about.
Which one? The Mountain Meadows? Did
Yeah.
you write on that one?
Yeah, not in this book, but
Oh.
I wrote Blood of the Prophets.
Yeah, which was one of your probably best-selling books, I imagine.
Easily.
Most acclaimed, anyway.
Easily.
The award-winning book. Yeah. This is an award-winning author we're sitting with here. But anyway, just amazing, because you did I read the chapter where you give a brief synopsis of what went down, and it just blew me away. Because I'm not from Utah, so I don't know the history, and it just whoa, blew my mind.
So everybody would just want to get to the meat of that. Did the Mormon leadership order that massacre or not, Will?
Nothing happened in Utah that wasn't directed from Salt Lake.
Known, directed, organized, governed, directed.
Okay, what you have is a blunder. Even guys like Brigham Young made mistakes.
No.
Yes. And Young was convinced the Army in 1857 was coming out here to hang him. And both he and Joseph Smith were terrified of being hanged because they knew what they were.
Frauds? Yes.
But back in this day and age, weren't they hoping to become like their own country? I mean, because it's kind of like human nature to want to close the door once you get somewhere. Like when I moved to Salt Lake 26 years ago, I was in heaven. This is awesome. I just want to close the door. No one else come in. I found it.
Yeah.
I'm done. And that's kind of what they were trying to do, is what the impression I got. Because these guys were just immigrants, right? They were just passing through or coming to settle. And
They were heading to California, I think.
They were coming out here to build up their strength so they could go back and conquer the New Jerusalem.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's right.
Where was the New Jerusalem? It was in Independence, Missouri. And I had a magazine salesman, very charming young black woman who came to my house in the 1980s selling magazines. And she told me, these crazy Mormons think that paradise is or the Garden of Eden was in Kansas City. And
I heard it was Branson, Missouri. Am I wrong there? No?
It's Independence, Missouri.
Okay.
But she said, and let me tell you, I'm from Kansas City, and it's not. It never was the Garden of Eden.
Never will be.
But the Mormons believed that they were going to go back and usher in the millennium.
wow, so they were kind of militant in a way then.
They were millennialists. They
Training
believed
and
the world was truly going to end in their lifetimes.
Wow.
They were coming out here to build up a kingdom to head back east and take over, I guess, to put it in crude terms.
They were going to ally with the blood of Israel.
Okay.
And what's the blood of Israel?
Jesus?
That's Lamanites.
Were they the good guys or the bad guys? I have no idea.
They switched sides back and forth. All that was left, though, when I grew up, were the Lamanites, the Indians.
Okay, yeah.
But the Indians were all descended from children of Abraham.
Right, which has been thoroughly disproven over and over again. But, yeah.
So many times.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how the notion evolves over time. But they were going to get the Indians to be the battle axe of the Lord and wipe out the opposition.
interesting. Wow. I didn't know that.
So that's why this is all it is documented in the whites want everything.
Okay.
But it is not emphasized as a main theme. But that's what the drill was. That's what they hoped and expected to do.
So I guess what I'm a little confused is what were they so scared about this particular group, that they massacred? Why did that group scare them so bad? Why did they feel the need to?
They didn't scare them. They were on their way out of Utah. The locals who did the murders created this enormous mythology of how all the evil acts they did and boasted about shooting Joseph Smith. But that didn't happen. And what happened was Brigham Young decided that he was going to make an example of his power with the Indians. And what better way than to wipe out an entire American wagon train?
Wow.
And this is like 30, 40 wagons or 200-300 wagons?
It's probably 18 to 30.
Okay.
But it's 120 people, mostly women and children.
Wow.
And they held out. Wasn't it like a 3-day battle? And they
I think 5 days. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
But what's despicable about it is that it was a calculated political act. And it was to show that he could cut the United States in half and close the overland road.
Which he basically demonstrated, yeah.
And how do we know this? Because he says it in the Old Brush Tabernacle in August 16th, I think, 1857. He says that explicitly.
Wow.
Tell your friends who are immigrants not to come through Utah, because if they do, what will happen?
Wow.
The Indians will use them up.
Wow.
Brigham Young was not an inspiring leader. He was a politically calculating, self-promoting,
Shrewd.
narcissist.
Wow.
And nothing that Donald J. Trump does
You just read my mind. You just read my
could
mind.
possibly surprise me, because I've seen
Wow.
Brigham Young do it all,
Wow.
including the potty mouth.
But it didn't quite work the way he thought it would, right? Because he ended up saying, no more massacres down there, Cedar City.
Well, okay, what happens is a United States captain named Stuart Van Fleet, shows up and tells him, the government is not going to come out here and hang you. We don't care about your religion. We want to establish a military district, as we have done in every other territory. And Young suddenly realizes, oh my God, I just set up southern Utah to slaughter an American wagon train. And as Van Fleet is in Salt Lake, a rider from Cedar City shows up and says, oh, John D. Lee's got these immigrants boxed in at Mountain Meadows. What should we do about it? Now, see, look, in most other places, when a settlement 35 miles from Mountain Meadows would get a message that the Indians were attacking, they'd have a force out there to liberate these people from the threat immediately. But in Utah, they got to send a guy to ride 250 miles
Wow.
to get permission about what should we do.
Wow.
And so what he does is, Brigham Young learned from Joseph Smith some tricks. One was have secretaries follow you around and keep a record. And Young himself says Joseph was always getting in legal trouble, but then he got secretaries to write down everything he did, and he never had any more legal troubles. So the lesson there was, as you commit the crime, come up with the alibi.
Would document it as you commit it, or as
Exactly.
you plan to commit it. Because
Yeah.
then, wow.
And so, as Juanita Brooks said, when you read Brigham Young letters, a lot of it's just nonsense. But then there'll be one sentence that really means is the key message. And the key sentence in what's called the Haslam letter, because he was the messenger, was don't mess with the immigrants, but the Indians will do as they please. So the message there is do whatever you're doing, but make sure we can blame it on the Indians.
Man.
And it's a political act.
Yeah.
How do you define terrorism?
Yeah.
It's using force, often military force, to kill civilians.
Wow.
And the Mormon Church has spent north of $20 million to write their own version of the massacre, which doesn't have a single original thesis in it. And they've only gotten one book done in the, let's see, it is now, it's 2002 minus 2019. That's 17 years, isn't it?
Wow.
And it'll be 20 years probably before their second volume of their Mountain Meadows opus comes out.
It's because it's tough to write fiction, I guess.
Well,
or slant facts to fit your narrative.
Or throw dirt in people's eyes. Remember the old Western scene where the bad guy would be rolling around in the dirt, and the good guy was about to win the fight.
Right.
He'd pick up the dirt and throw it in his eyes.
Yep.
That's what they're doing.
Wow.
Anyway, I'm sure the Mormons will love to hear me repeating all this again.
Oh, and they will.
I read where some guy pronounced you the biggest thorn in the side of the Mormons in Utah.
I think Fawn Brody, I think, still holds that title.
I don't know,
gotta be
man.
up there, Will. You got to be. What's your opinion on Fawn Brody?
Well, she wrote a brilliant biography.
Yes.
And it is still the best written biography of Joseph Smith. We know a lot more now about Joseph Smith since they opened up the archives.
Yeah, wasn't she given unprecedented access to some of these things?
No, she was denied access.
Oh, okay.
Even though her uncle was David O. McKay.
Yes, yeah.
The
exactly,
beloved
yeah.
prophet. But she didn't take advantage of it and didn't want to. But what we have is the Mormon historical establishment cranks out all these apologetic.
Hugh Nibley is foremost, isn't he?
Oh, yeah. And he's gone under the bus.
Well, they put him there?
Oh, yeah. But, he did it to himself. But anyway, there's a noted scholar, an American scholar, named Richard Bushman, who has written a very well-titled book called Rough Stone Rolling. And he tells the Joseph Smith story from Smith's perspective.
Oh, no, that's a good take. Yeah.
That's clever, isn't it?
Yeah.
But he can't write, and it's, how do you make Joseph Smith boring? I don't know, but Richard Bushman did.
Wow.
Wow. Interesting. So, Joseph Smith, I'm going to kind of exhaust everything I know about him, and maybe you can fill in some holes for me.
That's okay. I don't want to talk about Joseph Smith.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah, why? Yeah. Well, because he was such a successful fraud. The one point I'll say was that anytime the Mormons used to come to my house and try and convert me and send them missionaries down, I would say, okay, do you guys know whether Joseph Smith Jr. was ever accused of a crime? And they'll say, oh, well, a lot of people get falsely accused. Was he ever charged with a crime? Well, a lot of people get falsely charged. Was he ever convicted of a crime? Well, I don't think so. Yes, he was. Go look. You can still read these newspapers today. Joseph Smith Jr. was convicted of being a fraud and a disorderly person in Palmyra, New York, I believe.
A glass looker.
Yes, a glass looker, a diviner. I'll find fortune for you out in your fields, farmers. So he was convicted. 1 year later, he publishes the Book of Mormon. That's really, I don't have anything more to say.
Well, the Book of Mormon is its own indictment, because the way history works is when I write a book, that means I have to read about 100 books, and I have to go out and dig up the original sources. And the Book of Mormon purports to be the only accurate history of ancient America. But nothing that historians rely on, which includes supporting documents, archaeological evidence, and DNA now, all that shows that there never were Nephites nor Lamanites.
Battles and
Yeah.
this, yeah.
To make all this work, you would have to believe that God is a deceiver and hid all that archaeological evidence. And we just don't know enough about ancient America to discredit the Book of Mormon. Well, we do. We know we know Mayan dynasties going back to when the
Conquistadors.
the Nephite guys were supposed to be here. They go way back, and we know their names. We can now read the inscriptions. And what really disturbed me about growing up Mormon is this is all about racism. It is about white supremacy, because there were all these civilizations in America, and the red savage Indians could not possibly have built them. So who built them?
It has to be a superior.
White people. And what happens to the white people? The bad guys, the Lamanites, the Indians, kill them all. So there's all these elements of paranoia and nonsense and everything else. But see what I got myself.
A good question here.
Yeah, I'm a little bit at a loss because, again, I don't know a lot about Utah history like that. Yeah, but this is fascinating. This is fascinating.
I know too
to me.
much.
Yeah, well, you're the authority, man. That's interesting stuff.
What is it about Utah history that fascinated you the most? Is there a single topic?
Yeah, how did you end up back at Utah, number one, and how did you get? I mean, you're a historian, okay.
Yeah.
So then, I guess since you ended up here, that was the history you were interested in. Or?
What I learned when I lived in the Smoky Mountains was I'd never be a homeboy. I would never be welcomed by the locals because I was an outsider. Oh. But the one place I could go and they couldn't throw me out was Utah, because I was born here, I was raised here, and I just thought, well, and my grandfather and grandmother were aging. And so I wanted to get acquainted with them before they were gone.
Yeah. Right on. How much time do you currently spend with your brother Pat? I asked you that question in the car, but my listeners might like to know.
We see each other a couple of times a month.
Oh, nice.
And I love my brother, and I'm so proud of him.
Yeah, indeed. But, Pat, if you listen to this, your brother Will on the way in says, "Joe, I don't often use the word genius, but I'm going to use it with my brother Pat. Because if you do something at that level for 40 years, there's got to be something of, not just above average intelligence, but you're bordering genius there. So your brother loves you, man.
He's inspired.
And he's inspiring.
He's always lived in a world of his own. He almost died when he was a kid, and he was rescued. And we had a family cabin, my grandfather's cabin, up at Big Cottonwood Canyon, and we took Pat up there for a couple of days to let him recover. And I looked at him as he got out of the car and was crossing the creek, and I thought, my brother Pat is always going to be special.
Wow.
And he is.
Indeed.
He makes the world do what he wants the world to do. And it's partly our great luck. Born at the right time.
Indeed. To the right family, it sounds like.
Yep.
So you were baptized Mormon, and did you just go to church because you were forced to, or when did you leave the church? Did you formally withdraw?
I'm still a Mormon. I'm still officially on paper a Mormon.
You're on the books.
But when I was about 12, my mother paid me $20, or maybe it was $5, to read the Book of Mormon. And by the time I got to about page 20, and Nephi is cutting off the head of a purported king to steal his stuff with a steel sword. At that age, I knew there wasn't steel in the Middle East. And come on, the whole story is sort of creepy.
Oh, well, Sam Harris, another writer I love, Sam Harris, do you know him? He said it so well, is Mormonism, just take Christianity and add in a bunch of crazy shit. That's really all
exactly
Mormonism.
what it is. But what really got to me was growing up in the 60s, and I went to BYU for one academic year, which was the longest decade of my life. And I talked to Richard Bushman, the great Mormon historian, about getting into Stanford University, which was my goal. And he said, well, why don't you go to Harvard? Because that's where he went. But he said that, what did I think about the church? And I think it's all a bunch of nonsense. And he goes, yeah, but it's a good life. And it gave me the distinct impression that that's what he did. He knew that the history was not copacetic.
I'm thinking there's probably a good percentage of people that do that.
A lot of people.
Yeah.
I'd say the majority. Because people like Mormonism for a lot of reasons, and none of them have to do with history.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good
sense.
point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. It's the social aspect. It's the
Business
family
ties.
access.
These chapels, man, they're nothing but networking centers
Yeah,
for,
huge
well,
Pyramid schemes.
yes, a lot of those. And Utah leads the country in those.
Wasn't Amway created here in Utah?
No, that's the
Amway?
DeVos family.
Oh,
Betsy
okay.
DeVos.
that's
Yeah.
Oh, that's Amway?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
New Skin was, though.
Okay. Yeah, I remember
There's
that.
a good one. There's a good one. Yeah.
Multi-level marketing systems, which is what the Mormon Church is.
Well, the M in Mormon stands for marketing.
But
So you come back to Utah, and then somehow, some way, you end up at one of the premier corporations in Utah doing technical writing.
yep, that's just dumb luck. I lucked into that job because I managed to get an article published in Utah Holiday, which was quite the literary magazine at the time. And I got in in 1982, which was the last year you could have been hired by a company like E&S and know basically nothing about computers. And I'd studied a little bit up, but I knew about memory and processors. And
This is punch card days, right?
This is early days.
It's-
Yeah. I mean, well,
it's transition.
I was in,
Okay.
I graduated in 84, so in 82, we had Apple computers in our high school, but they were pretty rudimentary.
Same here.
Apple II.
Yeah, Apple IIs, yeah.
The old 8086 processors,
Something
I
like
think.
that, yeah.
But Ivan Sutherland, who is the true genius in Evans and Sutherland, had written a master's thesis. This is all documented in my LexisNexis book. But he had created interactive computing, which means how we use computers. Humans doing something on a mouse or
Keyboard, a screen,
a keyboard.
voice.
Before 1959, they
Wow,
didn't hook
wow.
keyboards.
No interface, user interface.
Yeah, there was no user. The words were invented long after. But it's just, again, my spectacular luck.
Yeah.
So you were writing about how to use this equipment, or
Yeah, technical. I focused on hardware because a DEC employee told me at the time, I'd like to write about hardware because hardware gets done.
interesting?
And what hardware in computers is coding wired up.
Yeah.
And software, as we all know, anybody who uses it much, is effervescent.
That's a good word. Yeah. Mhm.
And it is never done.
Never.
That's
it's
true.
always
Yeah,
been.
that's
Yeah,
true.
yeah. I remember I was watching back in the old days of computers, software and hardware. Somebody was trying to explain the difference between software and hardware, and somebody made a dirty joke about it. And I think we can get away with it here, main Joe. So just think about it this way: with computers, it's just the opposite of with people. With computers, the software goes into the hardware. With people, the hardware goes into the software. It's not a very good dirty joke, but it stuck with me.
It's the kind of one that won't go away.
Yeah. Maybe should. Yeah.
But anyway, I began working and learning about computers, and I did learn an awful lot. And
So is this about the time where you started really studying, really reading those 100 books to write? Have you written any Utah history at that point, or is this when you started getting interested in Utah history and started reading the books and researching?
it's in the 80s. It's while I'm at E&S.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And I
We'll write about Mark Hoffman time.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I called the church historian's office in the middle of the Mark Hoffman.
Oh, I would love to hear
Debacle.
that conversation. Wow.
I said, can I talk to Earl Olson? And Earl Olson was the chief of the archives at the time. And they said, just a second. They put me through. And I started asking him about a Don House article. And Don House was one of the key journalists in the Hoffman adventure. And now she's remodeled the house of Laban Morrell, who was the guy in Mountain Meadows who refused to vote to massacre the immigrants.
Interesting. Wow.
And she's remodeled this house with Torrey, and it's belonged to him. But Don is still a very good friend.
Cool.
And so I called him up because Hoffman, his technique was he would create a fraud.
But if I may, Will,
Sure.
some of our listeners may not be as familiar with Mark Hoffman. Let me give 20 seconds on it.
You got it.
Main Joe, if I may. So Mark Hoffman, back in 83, I want to say 82, 83, somewhere in
About 80.
80, yeah. He was a master forger. I don't know if he was a Mormon or an ex-Mormon at the time.
He was a Mormon.
Yeah. And I just use the word master forger. I have no idea if he's a master, but he was a forger. And
He was a psycho.
He was a psycho and successful for a time at duping Mormon leaders into thinking he brought them the real deal, the authentic documents. They would buy them from him for big dollars because they wanted to hide them away and not get these things publicized.
That's
And
pretty much the deal.
I think I got it right. And when he got close to being caught, he started making pipe bombs. He killed a lady named Kathy Sheets, if I remember that correctly, and another gentleman in his, I don't remember. Anyway, he became a murderer.
Stephen Christensen.
Yes, there we go. There we go. And so thank you, listeners, and please, Will, continue if you remember where you were there.
So anyway, Hoffman would plant information that would back up his story of what the fraud
In
was.
newspapers or in magazine articles?
Newspapers,
Okay.
largely the L.A. Times. And so he planted a story that somebody unnamed, meaning him, had been into the vaults in the Mormon church and seen a history of the church by Oliver Cowdery. And so I decided, well, I'm still a Mormon. I'm going to call to ask the church history guy.
I'm still qualified. I'm still part of the group. Yeah.
And I did pay tithing when I was a paper boy. So that ought to count for something.
It's when money's most valuable to you.
But so Earl goes through the ceiling. I said, do you have this history by Oliver Cowdery? No! I said, is it, have you ever seen the vaults? No! I said, well, is there an inventory of what's in the vaults? He says, no, and there never will be.
Wow.
And in fact, there was an inventory, and if they'd have paid attention to it, they would have known that what Hoffman was claiming he had, which was papyri and the
Salamander.
McClellan collection,
Oh,
which
yeah.
was somebody was gonna pay him big money for him.
Yeah. To keep them out of sight.
To keep them out of sight. But it was all malarkey. And, oh, jeez.
Other than Mountain Meadows, that's about the biggest black eye the Mormon Church has ever suffered. I would say, in my opinion, the Mark Hoffman Chronicles.
The DNA analysis of Lamanites.
That's a good one, too. Yeah.
But when you practice to deceive...
When at first you practice to deceive. No, what a tangled web we weave when at first we practice to deceive. Yeah. Indeed.
This brings me to a question kind of where it's kind of a silly question, but since we're kind of in a little bit of a lull, I'm going to bring it up anyway. Are you familiar with this new video game out that's called Red Dead Redemption 2?
No.
Came out about a year ago. It's like one of the hottest games going. It's still pretty popular a year later. Well, it takes place in like 1899, somewhere out here, probably New Mexico, closer to New Mexico, and there's mountains involved and stuff. But it's an interesting time of the way they portray it anyway, and I just wanted to know how accurate it was. That at this time, the West is getting more civilized. They're starting to chase down all these outlaw gangs and kind of do away with them. And I just wondered how accurate that is.
Well, the corporations were getting antsy, and they were going to replace the outlaws, who were mostly small ranchers. Who the big cattle corporations came in and fought the Johnson County wars and slaughtered the homesteaders, and it really is about the incorporation of the American West.
Interesting.
And okay, in the West, who hired the hired guns?
What do they call them? They called them Pinkertons in Red Dead Redemption 2.
Yeah, well, the Pinkertons were a security force that it came out of the Civil War.
Oh, okay.
But who hired the hired guns? Corporations, not ranchers and homesteaders and the ordinary folks. And that's now who is destroying the West, is our big financial interests.
So would you say they settled the West? I mean, I heard one story that said they said women settled the West because women would come out to the West and they'd say, "Hey guys, no more of this shit. Put the guns away. If you want us to stick around, you better just calm the shit down.
Let's make a home life here." Yeah.
Which kind of made sense to me.
That's very true. And there's a good analysis of it in terms of what happened to fandangos. And fandangos were wild parties held often during the California Gold Rush, and reflected the society of all males, basically. Mm-hmm. There were males and not much domestic life, but women did have a enormous role in settling the West. And it's part of the reason that the Mormons had a much better record on violence in their societies. In Mormon land, the violence was directed from the top down. But most Mormons are very decent, like it is today.
Yeah,
they're very decent people.
Decent people.
Yeah. They're great neighbors.
Love them.
Usually.
Yeah.
They just want to tax everything we like to buy.
Yeah. Our vices,
And they don't like education.
Well, I don't know. I think your brother might have.
Yeah.
He kind of said that we're kind of reaping the rewards now of their investment in education back in the day.
In the Depression.
Oh, yeah.
So are you saying that maybe that's... I don't know.
I wanted to question
what makes
Pat
you say
about
that?
Yeah.
What makes you say that they're not into education?
Because we spend less per student.
That's
these
the
days,
question I wanted to
days,
ask Pat right there.
Yeah.
I didn't think of it at the time.
Because the Republicans took over.
But back in the day, there must have been, I forget when Pat said it was, but there was a point that they did invest in education.
And we're reaping benefits today.
That's basically what he was saying.
But
so I'm wondering
this is an interesting point, and Will's right. Also, we spend we are 50. We are 50th.
Something shifted. Yeah.
In per pupil spending,
and their solution to that is tax food. Rob the poor.
I'm telling you, I remember growing up, my dad owned a small grocery store growing up, and so the food he sold wasn't taxed. And I thought, that makes sense. Yeah, why would you want to tax poor people? They're just kind of trying to feed themselves, right? But then they started creeping in all this novelty stuff, all this ice cream bars, all this stuff that they don't really need. We'll tax that. And then that led to more tax, and pretty soon they're taxing everything.
Bread,
milk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so it goes.
Yeah.
And anyway, I'll wrap up my commentary on my career in that I have been enormously fortunate. I will probably be... I'm one of the last editors of an Arthur H. Clarke documentary history of the West.
That's coming out soon, you said.
It's out. It's done.
Oh, I thought you had like 2 more volumes to go or something.
Nope.
Okay.
It's got 16 volumes, and it's done.
Nice.
And the White Swan Everything will be the next to last volume that the Arthur H. Clarke Company ever publishes.
History in the making here. Yeah.
And I'm really grateful to the culture that raised me and made me love history. And I've had a fun time doing it. And I think I really will still do it as long as I can. But it's becoming physically more and more difficult because I have a hard time typing. And
Oh my gosh! I just had a
keep
thought.
trying.
I know a young person who's in my life. She's my daughter. She's 15.
Yeah.
She loves history. She loves to write.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Wow! If I could somehow get you guys together and see if there's that could be cool. I'm just throwing it out there to the universe. I'm not. You know,
she'd do better to meet my wife, who is a very good historian.
Wow! I
Laura
might
Bear.
just try to make that happen.
There's our next podcast. Yeah. May
You
we
gotta
ask...
get Laura in to talk about the Hoopa tribe of
Oh,
California.
man. Okay.
I would love to know more about Native Americans and their
And she's got a
experience.
great voice.
I'll be back over Martin Luther King Day from the Keys.
There
So,
we go.
Yeah.
May
what
I
we can make
impose
happen.
on you to try to schedule your wife to appear on the
Or maybe
two
just
shows?
plant the seed.
I'll plant
the seed. Yeah.
Yeah, if you would.
That'd be awesome.
But anyway, 2 Joes, this has been a fun time.
It's been a
It's been a
hoot.
blast. Listeners, again, his book is
Oh.
River Fever, and he has many others.
many
Please look him up
others.
on Wikipedia. Find him many different places.
And the bookstores we want to promote, King's English and
Ken Sanders' Rare Books.
Ken Sanders.
let's help those small bookstores out.
Right on.
Okay.
Well, Man Joe, will you help me in thanking Will Bagley for appearing on the
thank you
Two
enough,
Joes?
Will.
Insightful, wonderful, fascinating, and we can't wait to have you again. Thank you so much.
Good luck on the podcast.
Thank you.